The crate weighed 42 pounds. Maya Reyes knew this because she had carried it 11 times that week, and her shoulders had started keeping count in a language made entirely of pain. The desert heat pressed down on the forward operating base like something that had decided to stay forever, and the air tasted like dust and burned rubber, and the particular kind of exhaustion that does not go away with sleep. She moved across the compound in the early morning, before the sun had fully committed to destroying everything beneath it. The ammunition crate was strapped to her back with 2 canvas bands that had been adjusted for someone taller. She had punched a new hole in the left strap with a field knife 3 months ago. Nobody had noticed. Nobody noticed much about Maya Reyes. She was 24 years old. She had grown up in Laredo, Texas, in a house where the television was always too loud, and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument the neighbors had ever decided to have. Her mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry. Her father had been a man who appeared in her life for stretches of time, and then disappeared again, like a radio signal that keeps losing its tower. Maya had learned early that the world did not arrange itself around what you needed. You arranged yourself around the world, or you got left behind. She had enlisted at 18, not because she had no other options, but because the military was the one place she had seen, as a girl, where a person could be measured by something other than where they came from. She believed that then. She still believed something close to it, though the shape of the belief had changed the way a coin changes shape after years in a pocket. At the base, her official role was support and resupply for the sniper team. She carried ammunition, cleaned weapons that were not hers to fire, tracked inventory, ran logistics. She was good at her job. She was exceptionally good at her job, which meant she did it so quietly and so completely that it became invisible, the way good plumbing is invisible until the moment it fails. The 3 snipers she supported were Chief Petty Officer Daniel Kowalski, Petty Officer First Class Gary Fenton, and Petty Officer Second Class Lou Briggs. Kowalski was 41, built like something that had survived weather rather than avoided it, with pale blue eyes and a manner of speaking that involved as few words as possible. He had 13 confirmed long-range engagements over 2 deployments, and the other men spoke about him the way people speak about a landmark, a fixed point you navigate around rather than interact with directly. Fenton was 30 and loud in the way some people are loud to cover the fact that they are paying close attention to everything. Briggs was 27, quiet in a different way from Kowalski, the way of someone who had not yet decided who he was going to be. None of them were unkind to Maya. That was the honest truth of it, and she held it honestly. They were not cruel. They did not mock her or make her days miserable. What they did was something more ordinary and more difficult to fight. They did not see her. She handed Kowalski fresh magazines, and he took them without lifting his eyes from the scope. She logged Fenton's equipment requests, and he initialed without reading. She existed in the space around their work the way a table exists in a room, useful, load-bearing, and unremarkable. She had qualified on the long rifle at 19 years old. The scores from that qualification still existed in a file. The file was in a system. The system was monitored by people who had other priorities, and Maya's qualification scores were not among them. She had raised the subject once, with a senior officer she had believed might listen. The conversation had been brief. He had told her that her current posting was critical to team function. He had used the word critical the way people use words when they mean the opposite of what the word says. She stopped raising the subject after that, not because she accepted the answer, but because she understood that raising it again would cost her something she could not afford to lose, the thin, compressed dignity of a person who has decided not to beg. On the morning she carried the 42-pound crate across the compound, the team was preparing for an Overwatch mission. The objective was a ridge position 3 kilometers from the base perimeter, overlooking a valley road that intelligence had flagged as an active transit route. The mission was classified as surveillance with engagement authority, meaning they would watch, and if watching became necessary, they would act. Maya packed the resupply bags herself, as she always did. She counted rounds with the automatic attention of someone who has done a thing so many times that the hands do it while the mind is somewhere else. She checked the weather data for wind speed and direction, and noted the numbers in the small field journal she kept in her left breast pocket. She had been recording wind data at that ridge for 6 weeks. Nobody had asked her to. It was the kind of thing she did in the space between what she was told to do and what she understood mattered. Kowalski gave the pre-mission briefing in the small operations room that smelled like instant coffee and old maps. He spoke in the flat, efficient language of a man who considers every word a small expenditure. Maya sat at the back of the room with her notebook. She was not required to attend the briefing. She attended everyone. The truck took them to the ridge drop point at 4:30. The walk to the position took 40 minutes through terrain that was mostly rock and low scrub, and the occasional thorn bush that seemed personally invested in making everything more difficult. Maya carried the resupply pack and her own kit. The snipers carried their rifles and their own loads. Nobody offered to help her. She did not expect anyone to. The ridge position was a natural shelf of rock, wide enough for 3 men to lie prone and observe the valley below through optics. Maya set the resupply pack against the back wall of the shelf and arranged herself in the support position, which was behind and below the shooters, with clear sight lines to the approach trail. The sky was still gray when they settled in. The valley below was empty and quiet, the road a pale line through the dark earth. Kowalski set up his rifle with the unhurried precision of a man performing a ritual he had performed so many times it had become a form of meditation. Fenton and Briggs flanked him, establishing their own positions. Maya opened her field journal and began recording. Wind from the northwest at 6 knots, temperature dropping, humidity low. The ridge faced east, and when the sun came up it would sit directly behind their position, which was good for concealment. She had noted this in her pre-mission assessment 3 days ago, when she had read the terrain report and then gone back and read it again more carefully. The morning passed in the slow, particular way that observation missions pass, not quietly because the desert is never quiet but without anything that required action. The road below showed occasional movement, none of it the movement they were watching for. Kowalski made a transmission at 8:30. Negative contact. Standing by. Maya ate her ration bar and drank water and watched the wind move through the scrub below the ridge and compared it to what she had written in her journal. The calculations she ran were not calculations she had been asked to run. They were calculations she ran because she could not help it, because her mind had been shaped by training into something that measured and adjusted and prepared without ever being asked. At 9:40, Kowalski moved to a better angle on the ridge shelf. It was a small adjustment 2 feet to the right toward a section of rock that jutted out over the slope below. The rock looked solid. It had looked solid for however many years it had been part of that ridge. It was not solid. The shelf gave way with a sound that was not dramatic, a dry, cracking shift, like something settling rather than breaking, and Kowalski went with it. He dropped 4 feet onto the slope below the ridge shelf, and the landing was wrong from the first moment, his left shoulder taking the impact at an angle that the human shoulder is not designed to absorb. The rifle left his hands on the way down and clattered to a stop against a rock 2 meters from where he landed. He made a sound, one sound, then he was still. Fenton was on the radio immediately, voice clipped and fast, reporting the situation to the base. Briggs moved to the edge of the shelf and looked down and said nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say. Maya was already moving. She had the resupply pack open before Fenton finished his first transmission. She pulled the field trauma kit and handed it down to Briggs, who lowered himself onto the slope. She looked at Kowalski, who was conscious and trying to sit up and failing at it, his left arm held at an angle that told her everything she needed to know about what had happened to his shoulder. Then she looked at the rifle. Then she looked at the valley road below. The radio on Fenton's belt produced a burst of sound that broke into fragments and then steadied into a voice from base. Active vehicle movement on the target route. Engagement window open. 12 minutes, possibly less. Fenton looked at Briggs. Briggs was on the slope with Kowalski, both hands occupied with the trauma kit. Fenton looked at his own rifle, positioned on the far left of the shelf, with an angle on the valley that the terrain blocked. He looked at Kowalski's rifle. He looked at Maya. She was already looking at it. There was a moment between them, Fenton and Maya, that lasted less than 2 seconds and contained about 10 years of everything that had never been said. Then Fenton looked back at the radio and began giving positioning coordinates to the base, and Maya picked up the rifle. It was heavier than what she had trained on at 19. The stock was adjusted for Kowalski's dimensions, which meant the length of pull was wrong for her. She corrected without thinking about it, her body remembering what her file had recorded and no one had acted on. She settled into the prone position at the edge of the ridge shelf. She opened her field journal to that morning's entries. Wind from the northwest at 6 knots. She looked at the scrub in the valley. The movement in it told her the wind had shifted slightly, maybe 4 knots now, coming more from the north. She adjusted. Below on the pale road through the dark earth, something was moving. She breathed in slow, out slower. The crosshairs found what they were looking for. She held the breath in the place her instructor had told her to hold it, years ago, when someone was still paying attention. Everything got very quiet. Then she made the shot. The vehicle on the road below came to a stop. The radio on Fenton's belt produced a burst of sound, and then a voice from base said words that confirmed what had happened. Fenton stood very still for a moment. Maya lowered the rifle. She looked at the ammunition pack against the back wall of the shelf. She had organized it that morning by caliber and quantity, the way she always did. She checked the count. Old habit, she checked it anyway. Below her on the slope, Briggs was talking to Kowalski in a low, steady voice. Kowalski said something back. His voice was controlled, the voice of a man who has been in pain before and knows how to keep it from running things. The radio crackled again. Mission confirmed. Medevac inbound. ETA 18 minutes. Maya sat with the rifle across her knees and watched the valley and waited. The desert had gone back to being quiet. The road below was still. The sky was a hard, clean blue that did not care about anything that had just happened. She wrote the final wind reading in her journal. 4 knots northwest. She closed the journal and put it back in her left breast pocket, where it always lived, and she waited for the helicopter to come. The helicopter was a US-60, and it came in low and fast over the eastern ridge, the sound of it arriving before it was visible, filling the air with a deep, mechanical roar that pushed against the chest. Maya watched it come in while she held the rifle steady across her knees and kept her breathing even. On the slope below the shelf, Briggs had Kowalski stabilized, arm immobilized, pressure held, the man himself conscious and furious in the particular way that physically capable people are furious when their bodies fail them without permission. Fenton had not said a word to Maya since the shot. He stood at the edge of the ridge shelf working the radio, his voice precise and professional, giving the medevac crew the landing coordinates, reading the wind, calling out obstructions. He did his job the way he always did it. What was different was the way he did not look at her. It was a different kind of not looking than she had experienced before, not the ordinary invisibility, the forgetting, the oversight. This was an active thing. A man processing something that had reorganized several things he thought he understood. She noticed it, she filed it. The helicopter set down 200 meters back from the ridge on a flat section of ground that the crew chief assessed in about 4 seconds. 2 medical personnel came off the aircraft at a run. Briggs guided them down the slope to Kowalski. Maya stayed on the shelf. There was a procedure now, and the procedure did not include her. That was fine. Procedures rarely did. She unloaded the rifle with the care and precision of someone handling equipment that belongs to someone else, which it did. She checked the chamber. Clear. She engaged the safety. She laid it flat against the rock wall and positioned it so the scope was protected from contact. Then she began breaking down the support position, collecting brass, accounting for every round in the resupply pack, making notes in her journal. This was what she did. This was always what she did. And she did it now with the same attention and the same economy of movement, because the alternative was to sit with the thing that had just happened, and she was not ready to sit with it yet. Maybe later. Maybe after the helicopter was gone and the ridge was quiet again and there was nothing left to organize. Kowalski was loaded onto the aircraft on a field litter. He was talking the entire time, short, clipped sentences, questions about mission status, equipment, the radio log. The medical personnel answered what they could and redirected what they couldn't. He looked up once from the litter, toward the ridge shelf. Maya was not sure if he could see her from that angle. She did not move either way. The helicopter lifted off at 11:03. She noted the time. Fenton stood watching it go until it crossed the ridge line, and the sound of it faded into the distance. Then he turned and walked back to the shelf and looked at the position Maya had already broken down and logged. He said, "You documented everything." She said, "That's what I do." He looked at her for a moment, not the way people look when they are seeing something new, the way they look when they are deciding what to do about something they should have seen a long time ago. He said, "The base is going to want a full debrief." She said, "I know." He picked up his rifle and his pack. She shouldered the resupply kit. They began the walk back to the truck pickup point, Briggs behind them, the three of them moving through the rock and scrub in the afternoon heat. Nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes. The desert made its usual sounds, wind, insects, the distant complaint of something living in the rocks. Maya's boots found their rhythm on the uneven ground, and her mind went to the calculation she had made before the shot, the adjustment for the wind shift she had caught in the scrub movement, the fraction of a degree correction that had been automatic, unremarkable, the product of training and habit, and the 6 weeks of wind logs that nobody had asked her to keep. She had not thought about it consciously while it was happening. That was the thing about preparation. When it worked, it disappeared. The moment before the shot, there had been no calculation, no thought, no decision. There had only been the crosshairs and the breath, and the stillness that comes when everything you know becomes everything you do. She had been that still once before, a long time ago, on a qualification range in Virginia, and the instructor had said 2 words to her afterward. She still thought about those 2 words sometimes, in the way you think about things that land cleanly and are then taken away before they can change anything. He had said, "natural shooter." Then the scores had gone into a file, the file had gone into a system, and Maya had gone to resupply. Fenton broke the silence at the 25-minute mark. He said, "You've been logging wind data on this ridge." It was not a question. He had seen her journal open before the shot. She said, 6 weeks. He said, "Nobody told you to do that." She said, "No." He was quiet again. Then he said, "The angle you had, that was the only angle that worked today. My position was blocked." She said, "I know. I noticed it the first week." He stopped walking. She kept walking. After a moment, he started again, and his stride was slightly different than it had been before, shorter, more considered, like a man watching where he puts his feet on ground he thought he knew. They reached the pickup point at 12:18. The truck was already there, the driver standing outside it in the heat, scrolling through something on a handheld device. He looked up when they arrived and counted them, and looked back at the truck and counted the seats, and did the math of a man who had driven 4 people out and was receiving 3. Briggs loaded the equipment. Maya climbed into the back seat. Fenton rode in front. The drive back to the base took 40 minutes on a road that felt like driving over the surface of something that had never been smooth and had no intention of starting. The base looked the same as it always did when she returned to it: low buildings, pale dust, people moving between structures with purpose and without greeting. The familiar smell of fuel and field rations, and the particular staleness of air conditioning units working against desert heat. The debrief was scheduled for 1500. Maya had 2 hours. She went to her quarters, which were a small room she shared with nobody at the moment, because her last roommate had rotated out, and a replacement had not yet arrived. She sat on her bunk and took off her boots and set them side by side on the floor. She opened her journal to the day's entries. Wind, temperature, humidity, target window. Shot recorded at 1002, confirmed at 1004. She wrote it all down in the same plain, careful handwriting she used for every entry, because field records are field records and they do not require different handwriting when something significant has happened. Then she closed the journal and lay back on her bunk and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was the same ceiling it had always been, water-stained in one corner. A small crack running from the light fixture toward the wall. She had memorized it in the early weeks, in the hours when sleep would not come, which were many. She thought about Kowalski on his way to the medical facility, probably already in surgery, his shoulder being put back into the shape it was supposed to be. She thought about the look on Fenton's face at the Ridge pickup, not admiration exactly, because admiration requires surprise and surprise requires an expectation that has been exceeded. What she had seen on his face was something harder to name. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person encountering information they cannot unfold. She did not spend time thinking about the shot itself. The shot was done. The shot was in the journal. What she thought about, in the hour before the debrief, was a room somewhere in this base where a file existed. A file with her qualification scores and her training records, and the single notation from the conversation with the senior officer 2 years ago. Current posting critical to team function. She thought about who would be in the debrief room at 1500. She thought about what they would ask and what she would say, and how she would say it plainly, without performance, without apology, without the particular kind of anger that burns through the things you need to keep. She had a different kind of anger she had learned to use. It was not hot. It did not flare. It was the kind that sits in the spine and keeps it straight. She got up at 14:45 and put her boots back on and laced them with the same precision she used for everything. And she walked to the operations building, and she opened the door, and she went in. The debrief room held a table with 6 chairs. 4 of them were occupied. Commander Leon Hatch sat at the head, 50s, gray at the temples, the face of a man who has spent his career making decisions about other people's lives and has become comfortable with it. To his left sat Lieutenant Commander Patricia Voss, the base intelligence officer, who was 40 and had the particular stillness of someone who listens to everything and responds to almost nothing. Fenton was there. And at the far end of the table, his arm in a field sling, his face set in the controlled expression of a man refusing to let pain be visible, was Kowalski. Maya had not expected Kowalski to be there. She sat down in the empty chair and did not show that she had not expected it. Hatch opened the debrief. He spoke for 4 minutes about the mission parameters, the engagement window, the outcome. He used words like complex situation and field improvisation. He said the mission result was a confirmed success. He said all of this without once saying Maya's name. Then he said, "Petty Officer Reyes, walk us through your actions from the point of Chief Kowalski's injury." She walked them through it. She spoke in the same plain, exact way she wrote in her journal, chronological specific, without elaboration or reduction. She described the wind reading, the adjustment, the shot. She described what she saw in the valley before and after. She described how she secured the weapon and broke down the position. She answered every question Hatch asked, and every question Voss asked, and the one question Briggs, sitting behind her against the wall, asked quietly at the end. Briggs asked, "How long had you been tracking that wind pattern?" She said 6 weeks. The room absorbed that. Fenton had not asked a question. He sat with his arms folded and looked at the table for most of the debrief, and when he did look up, he looked at Kowalski rather than at her. Kowalski had not asked a question either. He sat at the end of the table with his arm in its sling, and his pale blue eyes on Maya for most of the hour, with an expression she could not fully read because it contained things that did not often share the same face, something like shame and something like respect, and something else she did not have a quick word for. When the formal part of the debrief concluded, Hatch said they would take a short recess before completing the documentation. People stood, moved toward the door. Kowalski did not stand immediately. He sat for a moment, looking at the table, and then he looked up at Maya, who was gathering her journal. He said, "Raise." She looked at him. He said, "The wind shift. You caught it before you fired." She said, "Yes." He said, "How far off was my zero?" She said, "About a quarter minute of angle, given the distance." He was quiet, then he said, "That would have been a miss." She said, "Yes." He nodded, once, the nod of a man who understands exactly what has been said and is deciding how to carry it. She picked up her journal and walked out of the room and stood in the corridor, and breathed the stale, air-conditioned air for a moment. The anger in her spine was very straight. She went back inside when Hatch called the recess over. There was still documentation to complete. There was always documentation. She sat down and answered every question that was asked of her, and she did it well, because that was what she did. She did it well. She always had. The documentation took 3 days. 3 days of forms, supplemental reports, witness statements, equipment logs, mission analysis summaries. Maya completed her portion of each one with the same precision she applied to everything, and she sat in 2 more sessions with Voss, the intelligence officer, who asked her questions that started with the shot and worked backward through time, through the wind logs, through the pre-mission assessment, through the 6 weeks of data collection that no one had requested, and no one had known about until the moment it became the difference between a confirmed success and something else. Voss was a careful interviewer. She did not lead. She let silence do work. She wrote notes in a thin green notebook, and occasionally asked Maya to repeat something, not because she had not heard it, but because she wanted it on record in a second form. In the 3rd session, Voss set down her pen and said, "The qualification scores in your file. You know they're there." Maya said, "Yes." Voss said, "Have you ever formally requested reassignment based on those scores?" Maya said, "Once, 2 years ago." Voss said, "And the outcome of that request?" Maya said, "It was not advanced." Voss wrote something in the notebook. Then she said, "I'm going to be direct with you." Maya said, "Please." Voss said, "What happened on that ridge is going to create a record, a formal, documented, witnessed record. That record is going to be read by people above Commander Hatch's level. Some of those people are going to find it uncomfortable. Some of them are going to find it clarifying. What happens next depends partly on those people and partly on you." Maya said, "What do you need from me?" Voss said, "I need everything you've got, every wind log, every pre-mission note, every data point you collected that wasn't asked for. I need the full picture." Maya opened her field journal on the table between them and slid it across. Voss looked at it. She turned the first page, then the second. Her face did not change, but something behind it did a slight adjustment, the look of someone who had come in expecting something and encountered something larger. She said, "How many days does this go back?" Maya said, "From the day I arrived at this posting, 14 months. Voss turned more pages. She said, "You've been doing this for 14 months. Maya said yes. Voss said why. Maya thought about that for a moment. Not because she did not have an answer, but because the answer was large and the room was small, and she wanted to give the version that was both true and useful. She said because the situation might change. Voss looked at her. Maya said, I knew the situation might change. I did not know when. I kept the data because when the situation changed, the data would matter. The room was quiet. Outside, the base made its usual sounds. Vehicles, equipment, the indifferent machinery of a place that keeps running regardless of what any individual person inside it does or does not do. Voss closed the journal carefully. She said, I'm going to need to take this. Maya said, I made copies. Of course she always had. On the evening of the second day, Fenton found her in the equipment room where she was doing inventory. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke, the way people stand in doorways when they have come to say something they have been composing for a while. He said, I put your name in my supplemental. She kept counting rounds. She said, I know, I read the shared mission log. He said, I put it in clearly, not as support personnel. As the shooter. She stopped counting. She set the magazine down on the table. She looked at him. He said, Kowalski did the same. She said, I know that too. He nodded. Then he said, for what it's worth, and I know it might not be worth a lot right now, I'm sorry. She said, for what specifically? He looked at the wall for a moment. He said, for 2 years of not paying attention. She said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, but because the thing he had said was real, and it deserved a moment of real silence rather than a quick answer that let them both off the hook too easily. Then she said, pay attention now, that's the useful thing. He nodded again. He left. She picked up the magazine and finished the count. On the morning of the 4th day, Commander Hatch called her into his office, which was a room with a desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked out at the compound wall. He sat behind the desk. She sat in the chair across from it. He said, I've completed my portion of the mission documentation. I want you to know that what you're credited with in the official record reflects exactly what happened. She said, thank you. He said, there will be a review at the command level, above me. That review will include your full service record, your qualification history, and the mission documentation from this week. She said, I understand. He said, these reviews take time. She said, I know. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man trying to find the right frame for something. Then he said, off the record, do you know what the hardest part of this is going to be? She said, tell me. He said, the hardest part is that you were right all along. And when a person has been right all along and the institution was wrong all along, the institution has to decide what to do with that. Some institutions do it well. Some don't. She said, which kind is this one? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to push for the kind that does it well. She held his eye. She said, then push. She stood, she thanked him, she walked out. The compound wall that his window looked out at was the same wall it had always been. Plain, functional, built to keep certain things in and certain things out, and largely successful at both. She passed it on her way back to the equipment room, and she ran her hand along the surface of it briefly, not sentimentally, just the gesture of a person making contact with something solid. The anger in her spine was still there. It was keeping her very straight. The review took 11 days from the date it was formally initiated. 11 days during which Maya Reyes continued to do her job, carrying equipment, logging inventory, attending briefings she was not required to attend. While somewhere above her, in offices she had never seen, people she had never met read a file that had been sitting in a system for 5 years and decided what it meant. Kowalski came back from the medical facility on the 8th day. His shoulder had been repaired surgically, and his left arm was in a proper sling now, and he moved through the compound with the slightly careful gait of someone recalibrating their physical confidence. He found Maya in the equipment room on the morning of his return, the same way people always find her, by going to where the work is. He stood in the doorway. He said, "How's the inventory?" She said, "Accurate." He said, "It always is." He came in and sat on the edge of the workbench, which was not something he had ever done before. He had always been a man who stood. Voss told me about the 14 months of logs. She kept working. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it straight." She said, "All right." He said, "Did you know you were going to need to take that shot someday?" She stopped. She thought about it. The honest answer was not a simple one, so she took the time to find the simple version of it. She said, "I knew the data might matter someday. I didn't plan the specific situation." He said, "But you prepared for it." She said, "I prepared for the situation where I would need to perform, and would have to do it without any preparation time." He was quiet. She said, "When you don't get time to prepare in the moment, you prepare in all the moments before." He looked at the wall, he looked at the floor, he looked at her. He said, "That qualification score in your file, I pulled it." She said nothing. He said, "It's higher than mine." The room was quiet. Somewhere outside, a vehicle engine turned over and settled into an idle. She said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you push harder? 2 years ago when they turned you down, why didn't you push harder?" She said, "Because pushing harder would have cost me the position I had. And the position I had still let me do work that mattered, even if nobody knew it was mattering." He rubbed the side of his face with his good hand. He looked like a man carrying a weight he had recently discovered had been there for a long time. He said, "The review is going to go the right way." She said, "You don't know that." He said, "I know what I wrote in my statement." She said, "I read it." He said, "All of it." She said, "All of it." He nodded, then he said, "I meant it." She believed him. She did not say so because saying so would have made the moment about his comfort rather than the plain reality of it. She said, "I know you did." He stood up from the workbench. He adjusted the sling with his good hand. At the door he stopped and looked back at her. He said, "Raise, for what it's worth, and I know the timing makes it complicated. You are the best shot I have ever seen in a field condition." She looked at him. She said, "I know." He laughed. It was a short sound surprised out of him. Then he left. She turned back to the inventory. The count was still accurate. It always was. The notification came on a Tuesday, which was an unremarkable day in every other way. Maya was in the equipment room, where else, when the runner came in and said Commander Hatch wanted her in his office, not at a scheduled time. Now. The runner was 20 years old and trying not to look like he knew what the message was about, which meant he probably knew. She set down what she was holding. She walked to Hatch's office. He was standing, not sitting, when she came in. Lieutenant Commander Voss was there. Fenton was there. And behind Hatch's desk, which no one was sitting at, a man she had not seen before stood with a posture that said he had come a long way for this specific meeting. He was Captain Dale Norris. He introduced himself and shook her hand. He said, "Petty Officer Reyes, I want to make sure you hear this from me directly. The command review of your service record, your qualification history, and the mission documentation from the 14th is complete." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The review has resulted in a formal recommendation for reassignment. Effective in 21 days, you will be formally designated as a sniper candidate and entered into the advanced training pipeline. On successful completion, which your file makes abundantly clear is not in question, you will receive full designation." The room was quiet. She said, "Yes, sir." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected a different response. He said, "Is there anything you'd like to say?" She thought about the crate she had carried 11 times in 1 week. She thought about the file in the system and the drawer and the conversation that used the word critical. She thought about 14 months of wind logs and 6 weeks on one specific ridge, and the moment on a rock shelf when the world had narrowed to a scope, and a breath, and a calculation no one had asked her to be ready to make. She said 21 days. He said yes. She said, "Then I'll finish what I'm doing and be ready." Norris looked at Hatch. Hatch looked at the window. Voss looked at Maya with something that was very close to a smile, but had decided to be something more professional. Fenton said from his spot by the wall, "She means the inventory." Norris said, "I'm sorry." Fenton said, "She's been running inventory. She'll finish it before she leaves." Norris looked at Maya. She said, "The count has to be accurate when I hand it off." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Of course." She thanked him. She shook his hand again. She walked out of the office and back down the corridor and back into the equipment room, and she stood in the middle of it for a moment with her hands at her sides and looked at the shelves she had organized and reorganized over 14 months until every item on them was exactly where it should be. Then she sat down and picked up where she had left off. The count had to be accurate. It always had to be accurate. That was not going to change just because other things were changing, and she would not have wanted it to. She worked until the light shifted outside, and the bass moved into its evening rhythm, and then she stopped and sat in the quiet of the room for a while. She thought about the women she knew in other postings. Names and faces. Some she had trained with, some she had only heard about, women who could shoot, who could run, who could plan and execute and adapt. Women whose files sat in systems, whose conversations with senior officers had produced the same word, critical, wrapped around the same meaning. She did not know what her reassignment would mean for them. She did not know if it would mean anything. One shift in one file in one system was not a structural change. She knew that. She was clear-eyed about that. But it was a record, a formal, documented, witnessed record. And records, once they existed, could not be unwritten. On the 20th day before her departure, she finished the inventory. It was exactly right. She handed the completed log to Briggs, who would take over the support role, and she walked him through every item and every system and every notation in the margin that explained something the official documentation did not cover. It took 3 hours. Briggs said, "You didn't have to do it this thoroughly." She said, "The next person needs to know what they're working with." He said, "Still, you didn't have to." She said, "I know." She was thorough because she was always thorough, because the work mattered regardless of who was watching, and because whoever came after her deserved to start from accuracy and not from chaos. That was not a virtue she had decided on. It was just how she was built. Kowalski found her on the 19th day, in the hour before she was scheduled to pack her personal kit. He came to the equipment room because that was where she was. He said, "I want to tell you something." She said, "All right." He said, "I've been in this work for 17 years. I've known good soldiers and I've known great ones. What separates the two is not the ability, it's the preparation. The good ones prepare when they have to. The great ones prepare all the time, whether anything is expected of them or not." She listened. He said, "You prepared for 14 months for a situation that lasted 90 seconds. She said, "Yes." He said, "That's not normal." She said, "No." He said, "It's the thing that made the difference." She said, "It usually is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The pipeline is hard. Advanced sniper training is not a smooth road." She said, "I know what it is." He said, "I'm telling you because when it's hard, and it will be hard, I want you to remember that you already did the hard thing. You did it before anyone gave you permission to. You did it when no one was watching and nothing was guaranteed. She looked at him. He said, you were ready before they were ready for you. That's the story. Everything else is paperwork. She held his eye for a moment. She said, thank you, Chief. He nodded. He walked out. She stood in the equipment room, which was fully inventoried and clean and ready for the next person, and she let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she went to pack. The training facility was in a place that had different weather than the desert, greener, colder at night, with mornings that smelled like wet earth and pine, and the particular freshness of air that has not been heated past the point of comfort. Maya arrived with one bag and her field journal, which still had blank pages in the back section. She had started a new page the morning she left the base. Wind, temperature, baseline data for a new environment, old habit. She kept it. The advanced training program had 17 candidates in her intake. 14 men and 3 women. She knew none of them, which was fine. She was not there to know anyone. She was there to work. The first day was assessment, physical fitness, marksmanship, a written exam on fieldcraft, wind reading, ballistics, and mission planning that the instructors described as a baseline. Maya completed it in the same quiet way she completed everything. She did not look around to see how others were doing. She answered what she knew and left nothing blank. The scores came back on the second day. The lead instructor, a chief warrant officer named Gerald Park, called the group together in the morning and said that the assessment had given them a clear picture of where each candidate was starting from, and that starting position was not the same thing as finishing position, and that he had seen low starters finish high and high starters wash out, and that the only thing that predicted completion was the thing that could not be measured on a baseline test. Someone in the group asked what that thing was. Park said, what you do when nobody's asking you to do anything. Maya wrote that down. Not because she needed to, because it was accurate, and accurate things deserve to be recorded. The training was difficult in the specific ways it had been designed to be difficult: sustained physical stress, sleep reduction, decision-making under fatigue, precision work performed when precision is hardest to maintain. Maya moved through it with the same economy she had always moved through things. She did not perform. She did not compete. She prepared and she executed, and when she fell short of something, she identified where and why and corrected. And she did not spend time on the feeling of having fallen short, because the feeling was not useful and the correction was. She was not the fastest in the group. She was not the loudest or the most aggressive or the one who drew the most attention in any session. She was consistently the most accurate. The range instructors noticed by the end of the second week. Not loudly. The way instructors notice things they need to incorporate into their understanding of a group, quietly, with the expression of people updating a map. Park noticed on the third day. He said nothing until the end of the second week, when he walked up to her at the range after a session and looked at the target she had fired at, which he had already seen and whose grouping he had already measured. He said, "How long have you been shooting at this level?" She said, "Since I was 19. He said, "What were you doing between 19 and now?" She said, "Carrying ammunition." He looked at her. She said, "Resupply and support, 5 years. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's a waste." She said, "Yes." He said, "It won't be a waste anymore." She said, "No." He walked away. She reloaded. There was a woman in the intake group named Caroline Drew. She was 26, from Ohio, with the steady calm of someone who had made peace with being underestimated so many times that it had stopped being a thing she spent energy on. They recognized something in each other in the first week without naming it, the way people recognize a shared language without having to explain the grammar. They ran together in the mornings, mostly in silence. Caroline was faster on the run. Maya was faster through the planning scenarios. They filled in each other's gaps without making it a project, the way two people who respect each other's competence work together when there is no ego involved. On the 14th evening, sitting outside after a session that had lasted 11 hours, Caroline said, "How did you end up here?" Maya told her, the short version plain and in order. Caroline was quiet when she finished. Then she said, "You took the shot." Maya said, "Yes." Caroline said, "And it worked." Maya said, "Yes." Caroline said, "What would have happened if it hadn't?" Maya said, "I'd still be carrying ammo." Caroline looked at the sky. She said, "That's a terrible system." Maya said, "Yes." Caroline said, "Are you angry about it?" Maya thought about the anger in her spine. She thought about what it had done for her, kept her straight, kept her preparing, kept her moving through the years without bitterness eating through the things she needed to keep intact. She said, "I use it." Caroline said, "That's probably the only honest answer." They sat in the quiet for a while, the evening getting darker around them, the insects starting up in the grass at the edge of the range. Maya opened her journal and wrote the day's wind data. Caroline watched her do it and said nothing. She didn't need to. The graduation from the advanced training program happened on a morning in late November. The sky was flat and gray, the kind of gray that was not threatening but was not gentle either, just there, doing its job. The ceremony was functional, certificates, handshakes, a few words from the commanding officer of the facility, a woman named Captain Helen Cross, who spoke about the program and what it meant and what would be expected. Maya stood in her row and listened. Cross said, near the end, that the ability to perform under pressure was not rare. What was rare was the ability to prepare for pressure when no pressure was visible, when nothing was demanded, when the easier path was to do less and wait to be asked. She said, "The people who change outcomes are the people who are ready before the moment requires them to be." Maya kept her face still. She thought about a 42-pound crate, and 11 times carrying of it in 1 week, a punched hole in a canvas strap, a field journal with 14 months of wind readings, a ridge shelf and a dropped rifle and a 12-minute window, and a breath held in exactly the right place. She thought about a file in a drawer. She thought about the women who were still carrying. The ceremony ended. People moved. There were photographs, which Maya stood in because she was asked to, and conversations, which she engaged in because they were real conversations with real people who had earned her attention. Park shook her hand and said 2 words. She thought about another pair of 2 words years ago from a different instructor on a different range. Natural shooter. Those words were still in her. They had always been in her. The difference now was that they were also on the record. She walked out of the ceremony and stood in the flat gray morning with her certificate in one hand and her field journal in the other. She opened the journal to a blank page and wrote the date and the wind reading and the temperature. New place, same journal, same handwriting. The blank pages at the back were fewer now than they had been when she arrived. She would need a new one soon. She had known that for a while and had already identified the specific kind she wanted, with the same field-resistant cover and the same page weight that held ink without bleeding. She was prepared. She had always been prepared. That was the story, all of it, from the first heavy crate to the last clean entry. Not a story about a single moment, though the moment was real and the shot was real, and the valley road below the ridge had gone still because of it. It was a story about the 14 months before the moment, about the work done in the silence between what was asked and what was possible, about the preparation that no one sees, which is the only preparation that matters, because the moment never announces itself in advance. She closed the journal. She put it in her left breast pocket, where it always lived. She walked into whatever came next. She was ready. She had always been ready. That was the part nobody had bothered to check.